James, once again, just to kind of throw that out there. Over at Flight Apprentice, we're just basically an online ground school that we feel very fortunate to be able to kind of partner with Girls Love to Fly and help provide scholarships and encourage a lot of aviation learning. This is our web page. I believe that is showing up. That's correct. Jamie, are you seeing that?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, this is our website. Basically, it's just designed to be an online learning platform for private, instrument, commercial, many of the courses you see here. And it's basically just designed to supplement online learning. And then at the end of the courses, you are provided with an endorsement to take your written exam for whatever course that you are using to pursue for that license. So yeah, no, it's fun to be here. Today, I was told we'll be talking about human factors and some aircraft limitations. So I figured I would just start by opening up. I don't know how this usually works, but the same sort of Q&A. But does anybody have any ideas about aircraft limitations and figure out any specific limitations they're aware of or any specific limitations they want to know more about throughout the course of today's meeting? Anybody?
I guess we're going to let you take it away. And if anybody has questions during this whole thing, you can interrupt, you can raise your hand, you can put it in the chat. Like, totally don't hesitate to just reach out with, whatever question you have. And then also, Christine is one of our newer instructors at Girls Love to Fly. So we're excited to have her. Now, those of you who don't know, we do give away one of the Flight Apprentice ground schools each month. We've been doing that for like a couple years now. So if you have any students that want to apply for this ground school scholarship, it's really awesome. So I had to throw that out there too. All right, that's all. That's all I got.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Jamie. Yeah, that's my whole goal is just, yeah, let's keep this like kind of open forum. So yeah, please, if you have any questions, please definitely speak up, and we'll do our best to answer those, and we'll go from there. Anyway, let's see here. I'll try to put a different document up now, and bear with me. It's my first time hosting any sort of like e-learning type thing on Zoom. So yeah, no pressure. So let's see here. It says I can do a new share. Let's move to this. You're looking at a Cessna 150 1977 POH. I saw it did look like there is a 150 associated with Girls Love to Fly. So I figured this would be an appropriate section to look at. So overall aircraft limitations, the limitations on any airplane are there mostly to keep everybody safe. And obviously, these airplanes are not they're not indestructible. So by having aircraft limitations and being familiar with and knowing our limitations, that helps us operate within and ideally up to the full operating envelope of our aircraft, taking advantage of every ounce of performance it has, while still understanding where those limits are, so that we don't put ourselves in any undesired aircraft states or hurt the airplane. Where these limitations really kind of come in, just kind of a couple notes in the beginning is, especially I like to stress this with older airplanes, is that when you're looking at airplanes that are, from, the last century, especially, the training fleet is aging. And so definitely take into account that even though your aircraft POH or flight manual or whatever you're looking at does publish the limitations, there might be, a difference in terms of what you actually experience in the airplane. And I say this because just because the airplane was certified to a certain standard when it was brand new, does not mean that 40 years later, that airplane can be expected to measure up to those same standards after training, potentially hundreds of pilots and being, beat up for a number of years. So definitely, take all these a little bit of a grain of salt as we move through some of these. So of course, off the bat, everyone's mostly familiar with airspeed limitations, right? We're generally associated. The first thing we think of limitations, we think of airspeeds, right? V speeds specifically. Mainly, is that just the maximum speed or the minimum speed you need to be at for certain maneuvers? There's always a speed we seem to associate, but a lot of people don't necessarily dive into why these speeds exist or what that looks like from an aerodynamic standpoint. It's just a number that we're taught, and we just kind of accept that number. So VNO, max structural cruising speed. The POH air limitations section is really good at just saying, hey, here's the speed. This is what it means. Every manufacturer does have a little bit of a different interpretation of this. They're generally supposed to fit into the same mold, but sometimes you'll see that manufacturers do exercise a little bit more discretion when it comes to these speeds. VNO, how do we normally indicate this? Anybody have any thoughts on how this is normally indicated actually on your airspeed indicator?
The yellow arc.
Yellow arc. Thank you, Christine. Yes, I appreciate that. And I'm going to just start calling on people at some point. So yes, yellow arc. So maximum surgical community speed, right? And that's a speed, it says, do not exceed this speed except for in smooth air, and then only with caution. So this is one of those kind of debated topics. If you're doing an emergency descent or something of that nature, how fast do you really want to be going when you're going downhill, especially in turbulent air? If you're trying to put out a fire or something like that, that's potentially a consideration, especially if it's on the wing or if it's up, forward side of the firewall, up in your cowling. But still, definitely a speed you want to take with caution if you're going to exceed the social cruising speed and accelerate into that yellow arc. Maneuvering speed. Okay, maneuvering speed. Let's see. What do we typically associate maneuvering speed with? Any ideas why we have maneuvering speed, why it varies based on weight or anything like that? Christine?
Yes, I'm pretty sure it goes with the loading of the wings, right? So when we're doing heavy maneuvers, we increase the load that we put on the wings. And so that weight is very important.
Yeah, absolutely. So maneuvering speed, if we start with the description, it says, do not make full or abrupt control movements above this speed. So this is a 1977 POH. It doesn't necessarily reflect like what a maneuvering speed is. It just says, don't make full or abrupt control inputs above this speed. And then it says, hey, here's some speeds, but hey, here's also some weights. And we can see that if this is knots of indicated airspeed, as the weight decreases, the speed also decreases, and vice versa. As the weight increases, right, the speed also increases. But don't make full or abrupt control inputs above the speed. That doesn't really help us understand like a Y factor there. So that's essentially what we would call like an application level of knowledge, where it's like, okay, I understand like this is the speed, don't do this, but we don't really understand why. So let's dive into that real quick here. I'm gonna see if I can put a different window up. Let's go back to, there's a built-in whiteboard. Wow, okay, this is part of Zoom, that's cool. I'll use this instead of the proprietary one, I guess. Okay, so when looking at maneuvering speed, this might get a little bit mathematical, so feel free to kind of stop me at any point in time here. But if we are looking at your average airfoil, and try to bear with me here while I draw wings, I lost my stylus, didn't find it for the meeting, so I'm going to be using this as a trackpad. This is an airfoil, just pretend it's nice and round and smooth, and this line I just labeled right here. What line, let's change the color here. What line is this? Ideally going from the front leading edge to the trailing edge. Christine?
It's the chord line.
Right, and the chord line is something that helps us figure out a very integral part of how our airplane flies, known as the angle of attack. So if our airplane is flying in this direction, and the relative wind is always parallel and opposite to the flight path. So the airplane's flying that way, and the relative wind is then parallel and opposite, is going like this, then the relative wind is striking the airfoil up here at the leading edge. Now, if this chord line here, again, trying to go from the trailing edge to the beginning of the leading edge, if we extend that in front of the airfoil up here, the angle between that chord line and ultimately the relative wind is known as what? Let's see. DeVry? Lurking in the chat. Christine, I guess you're it today.
Sorry, angle of attack.
Angle of attack, right? Okay, so angle of attack. Okay, so now if we're gonna look at this a little bit more mathematically and try to understand why maneuvering speed is changing, what we're gonna first start to associate with is that we need to kind of trust me here for a second and go with kind of an out of the box rote definition, okay? And that is the maneuvering speed. So VA, right, is, and I'm not going to draw this out because that would be ridiculous on a stylus, but I will put it in the chat, is the speed at which you can apply full and abrupt control input in a singular axis without damaging the aircraft. Now, even that doesn't necessarily, and that's in the chat, by the way, that doesn't necessarily help us understand. It just says we won't damage the airplane. Okay, well, how do we not damage the airplane? By applying full and abrupt control input. Now, I want to be very clear that full and abrupt control input is essentially you flying along at cruise and like straight level accelerated flight, and then just out of the blue, essentially you see like a deer jump out in front of you, a cumulo deer, and you just apply full and abrupt back pressure. Typically, is the most common example. You just grab the yoke and pull all the way back to the stop as fast as you can, and your plane just aggressively pitches up. Okay. What maneuvering speed is saying is that you can do that at or below one of the published speeds for the weight you're at, and it won't hurt the airplane. And we accomplish this because the airplane will stall before it actually breaks the airplane. Like, okay, that's well and good, but how do we actually prevent, how do we actually know that we're going to stall? Okay, so VA, I'll just leave that at C chat. Okay, so if we go back to the airfoil ledger over here, let's just, for a minute, go back to our POH, and I'll just read those numbers that it has. So it says at 1,600 pounds, it's 97 knots. Okay, 97 knots. Okay. 97 knots. Undo doesn't work. Okay. Knots. Okay, and then that's 1,600 pounds. So then you have a given angle of attack. I apologize, I really need to find that stylus. Okay, it's like trying to draw on one of those like e-sign things, the checkout. Okay, so at 97 knots and 1,600 pounds, you have this angle of attack, which we'll just say is like 15 degrees. Okay, this is like a somewhat arbitrary number. Okay, so if this is your angle of attack at this weight and this speed, we are also concerned, if we're going to stall before we damage the airplane, that means that we need to essentially hit the critical angle of attack before before anything bad happens. So the critical angle of attack might be up here. Okay, I'll put that in green. Okay, so if the airfoil was then reshaped, if we increase our angle of attack like this, and this is our new chord line, right? And it goes all the way up here. Then this is the angle of attack that we would actually stall at, okay? So if we're at 15 degrees, let's just say that we stall at 20 degrees, then we have 5 degrees of angle of attack change, okay? So if you're flying along at 1,600 pounds and 97 knots, and this is your angle of attack, then you'll basically hit 20 degrees pretty quickly and you won't stall or break the airplane. But now let's look at a different situation. Let's say that based off that POH, it says 1,450 pounds, it's 93 knots. So as weight increases for straight level unaccelerated flight, what happens to angle of attack? Christine, you're a CFI, right?
I am, yeah. And
Okay.
no worries, but it's Christina.
Oh, it is, sorry.
That's all right. And I didn't hear your
Okay.
question, if I'm being absolutely honest.
No worries. I was asking, I'm like, okay, cool, you're a CFI, so excellent. You can help me out here a little bit. So so as we're cruising along in straight level accelerated flight, if we had two identical airplanes, and then on one of those airplanes, we just added some weight, what would happen to our angle of attack?
I guess it depends on where that weight is.
Okay. That's actually a good answer. That's way that you got me on technicality there. So let's just say, and actually I figured out how I can do text. So I'm gonna clean this up, make this a little bit more legible here real quick. So let's go 1,600 pounds, 97 knots on this wing. Sweet. Nice, and I can move it. Fantastic, okay. So then if this wing is, let's say at 1,450 pounds and 97 knots, okay. My pen back. Okay, so this wing here is lighter, right? 14 at the bottom wing is lighter. So if it's at 1,450, 97 knots, does it have a greater or lesser angle of attack than the wing above? It has a lesser angle of attack. So in this case, let's say wind would be like this. Okay, because the flight path is like this. And then as a result, there we go. There's the angle of attack. We'll say, and this is not to scale, we'll say this one's at 10 degrees. Okay, so if this wing here is at 1,450 and 97 knots, and there's a 10-degree angle of attack, and the angle of attack at which we stall at is still 20 degrees, right? Because that's specific to this airfoil. It's still somewhere up here. Okay, still stalls at 20 degrees. Okay, then this bottom wing here being at a lighter weight but the same airspeed, is at a low angle of attack, and therefore there is more net angle of attack change than the wing above, which only has 5 degrees. This wing had a 10 degrees angle of attack change, and subsequently that change is really what we're concerned about. So that change of angle of attack, when you like abruptly apply the controls, how close you are to the angle of attack, that travel, that let's see, in terms of like math terms, right, would be known as, just put a bunch of symbols out here, option for a bunch of keys, there we go, would be the delta change in AOA. Okay, so the change in AOA is greater, so now that's going to translate to a higher load factor. So also looking at limitations, what is the high? What are the normal category load factor limits? Anybody have any idea? Normal category load factor limits? .8 positive G's. Okay. And then negative is 1.52 G's. Okay. Now, why do we care about this? Well, this is how our maneuvering speed actually works in terms of this change in load factor is equivalent to the amount of load factor we're able to actually put on the airfoil. And most people simulate, kind of associate G-forces with like an actual solid like number as opposed to like a numerical value. But in reality, G-forces are an acceleration. So instead of being like a solid number, like a 100 knots is like just a solid normal numerical value. A G-force is actually something that should be expressed in terms of like a foot-pound, like a torque, or like a meters per second squared, because it's a measure of acceleration. And so looking at our POH numbers in our two different airfoil designs, if 97 knots protects you at 1,600 pounds, the reason it would drop at 1,400 pounds is because you're able to put more acceleration on that airfoil before it stalls, which would translate to a higher G-force, which would translate to more weight on the airplane. So let's just for a second dive off into like some mathematical realms. The formula for lift, don't worry about memorizing this, is that lift equals 1/2. Find some Greek letter here. We'll just go with X. It's not X, but it's not P either. 1/2 rho V squared SCL. Okay, so 1/2 rho V squared surface area coefficient of lift. What this is referring to is how much lift is being generated by your airfoil. Now, I don't want to get into this too much, but let's just say that you're at 1,600 pounds, okay, with airfoil 1 over here, and you're in a straight, in level turn at 60 degrees bank. You're pulling 2 Gs. So then, how much weight would be supported by the wing, Christina? If we're in the 60-degree bank turn, so we're pulling 2 Gs,
Twice
and we are at
of the aircraft, right?
Sorry, what was that? Didn't
Twice
quite
the
catch
weight, right? So two times the weight of the aircraft if we're 1,600.
Exactly.
pounds,
Yep. So
32.
it's 2 Gs at 60 degrees. So it would be twice 16. So we would be at
3,200 pounds.
3,200 pounds. Okay. So if the aircraft weighs 3,200 pounds, then at that point, the aircraft weighs 1,600 pounds. But because we have twice the weight of the airplane being is part of that acceleration in that level turn, then is it safe to assume, and this is a question, feel free to disagree with me, but is it safe to assume that we then have, if weight is equal to 3,200 pounds, then subsequently that must also, their tool basket is here a little bit disorganized. There we go. It's safe to say that that then also equals lift. If we're level and we're not accelerating, if the weight equals 3,200 pounds, then that is equivalent to 3,200 pounds of lift. That's exactly what's going on. So we're in a 60-degree bank turn. We have, we're level, we're holding altitude. And so we know that at 60 degrees, we're pulling 2 Gs. And so then because of that, we're supporting twice the weight of the airplane, which is 3,200 pounds. And the wing is making twice the lift. So lift is equal to 3,200 pounds as depicted down here by this statement that I just underlined. So to do so, and then moving forward a little bit more with that, we can then say that load factor, right, is equal to 2. And if load factor is equal to 2, then that must mean that load factor equals 2. How do we get 2 from this situation? Well, we divide the weight. Ooh, that was not very pretty. Apologize. There we go. We divide the weight W by the lift. So now we can say, oh, okay, if we divide our weight of 3,200 pounds, because we are accelerating the airplane in a turn, so it's much like when you put water in a bucket and you swing the bucket around and it goes upside down, but the water doesn't fall out of the bucket because the water is being held into the bucket by what we know as centripetal force, but it's because that acceleration is pushing up on the water faster than gravity is able to pull it down when it's upside down. And so it's creating, it's increasing the weight of the water due to the gravitational forces. So we have 3,200 pounds over the lift. At this point, I'm sorry, this is backwards. It's equal to the lift divided by the weight. just delete that from the recording, Jamie. Okay, so if we're making 3,200 pounds of lift, now the math works, okay? Because the airplane weighs 3,200 pounds on our theoretical turn. So lift, as we discussed, up here is equal to 3,200 pounds because we're level, we're descending, right? If the lift was not equal to the weight, we would be descending. So we have 3,200 pounds of lift being generated, but the airplane only weighs 1,600 pounds, okay? Now we are back into a position where now load factor we know equals 2 because lift divided by the weight. Okay, so this is starting to get a little bit drawn out, obviously, because I'm struggling to actually draw effectively here. But going back to our airfoils, right? We can now see that if the lighter airfoil is at the same speed as the lesser angle of attack, which means it's able to pull more G's and have a higher rate of change before it reaches a critical attack and then stalls. Similarly, and conversely, this weight option also works with, get my eraser over here. This eraser here is very effective. This is nice. Okay, we'll get another couple airfoils drawn over here. So here is an airfoil that's going to depict the kind of a very similar but different relationship. So this airfoil, very high camber airfoil, we'll say that, change the angle of attack on this one. Don't mind my weird kind of drawing expression. Trying to make this somewhat understandable. Okay, there's a chord line, a lesser chord line. Okay, if both these now weigh the same, so we'll say that both 1,600 pounds. This is also 1,600 pounds. Some viewer input here. If these drawings are to scale and do in fact represent the actual angle of attack of the airfoils, and this one's effectively just about nothing. And this one, again, they're both falling level. So this one here is a higher angle attack, right? Which wing is moving faster, Christina? Which one has a higher velocity?
I would guess the one with the smaller angle of attack.
That would be correct, because with the smaller angle of attack, it is moving faster since that wing has a lower coefficient of lift. What this is 93 knots. We'll say this is 97. Actually, we'll say it's 100. Okay. All right. That would be correct. There we go. Those to line up properly. So both weigh the same. This one's moving faster, so it has a lesser angle of attack. This wing is slower, so it has a greater angle of attack. But the lift on both wings is the same because both wings are in straight and level and accelerated flight. So we'll say equal lift. Okay. Tracking with me so far? Everything's kind of, is it all adding up? Okay, that is a yes, thumbs up. Okay, sweet. All right, so that's the two examples. This example over here on the left, this example was based on, they both are going the same speed over here, where I'm drawing now. Both airfoils are the same speed, but they have different weights, so the angle of attack is changing. And over here in this example, they have different speeds, but the same weights, the angle of attack is changing on these two airfoils over here. Okay, well, what does this actually mean for us? We've seen that we have different angles of attack, which causes us to be maybe closer to or farther from the critical angle of attack. How does this translate into the actual limit that we see here in the POH of 97 knots for 1,600 pounds or 93 knots of 1,450 pounds? Well, what we're ultimately looking at is we're looking at the adjusted accelerated stall speed. So all sim limitations, we find a published stall speed, which looks like it's bottom of the green arc because it'd be flaps up, so it'd be 47 knots. So I will write that up here. Published stall speed is equal to 47 knots. Okay. So if 47 knots is our published stall speed, let's see if I can do a little adjustment here. There's no cursor. Perfect. Okay. We are able to actually calculate how fast we will stall at a given load factor. So the reason I brought up the normal category load factor limits of 3.8 and 1.52 is because those are the quote unquote limitations where we would expect there to be some sort of damage to the airplane beyond that. And so what we're able to do is say, okay, well, if our normal stall speed is 47 knots, then on our iPhone calculator, we can use the following formula, which is the adjusted stall speed is equal to, we'll call that VSLF, new stall speed with load factor, is equal to our regular stall speed times the square root of the load factor. Okay, and so what we do is we say 3.8 is the limit. We take the square root of 3.8. Okay, but it's down here as 3.8 square root times 47 is 91. So then why is it less than the published speed? Well, a couple reasons. The System 150 has a utility category. The utility category limitations are higher. So utility category limitations, typing those out on the bottom now. Those are airplanes that you associate with like doing spin training and things like that. A utility category is 4.4 positive G's, okay? So if we run these same numbers, and we say 4.4, and we push the square root, and we multiply that times 47, 98.5 knots, okay? So that's within about 1 knot of our actual published limitation. And the reason for that is, and the reason that this actually matters to kind of tie this all together, is that with these different angles of attack that we're associating over here at the different speeds and weights, if we take an airplane that's at say 1,600 pounds and we multiply that times 4.4, we end up with 7,040 pounds. Okay, but now if we're lighter, we'll use the POH number for the 1,300 pounds, which is a lower speed. 3.8 times 1,300 times 3.8. Sorry, let's see, 1,300 times 4.4 is 5,720. And then 1,600 times 3.8 is 6,080 pounds. So we're within kind of a couple hundred pounds. So what this is telling us is this is saying, okay, at this weight, at 1,600 pounds, if you apply full and abrupt control input and you move the control all the way to the stop, then at that point you will have a certain amount of weight that is being supported by the wing to generate that lift, and then you will stall. That amount of weight that is supported by the wing at 1,600 pounds is essentially equal to the exact same amount of weight that you would put on the wing if you accelerated faster, because you're at a lesser angle of attack at a lighter weight. You would still stall at that same weight. I'm sorry, that same, you would still reach the same angle of attack at a lower speed because you have a farther distance to travel in terms of your angle of attack, as we can see over here on this diagram. So that's kind of as far as I'm going to go in on that. It's kind of a confusing topic, and we'll see if that actually worked as far as like a Zoom presentation. More info, we do have that on our Flight Apprentice course in a much more easy to digest version. So we'll go back, I'll put the POH up again, and we'll kind of start moving through that unless there's any questions related to maneuvering speed and why that is a limit. Here's POH again. And okay, one final note on maneuvering speed. You really want to only do that like in one axis at a time. So like typically it's just a pitch axis. If you read into some of the more stringent certification requirements, if you start like pulling the elevator all the way back, adding in a bunch of aileron and like stepping on the rudder, the airplane like will break apart. So it's very important that you only do like one at a time. So anyway, we have flap limitations. Obviously that's in there. Maximum speed you can extend flaps, windows, and the rest of the V speeds that we're familiar with. The wide arc being, your operating range for extending flaps, and then the speed that you'll stall with flaps in. Green arc being your flaps up. There are some good notes in here. Your flaps up stall speed as well as your normal operating range. It does include, it says, hey, the lower limit is maximum weight, VG, at most forward CG with flaps retracted. Upper limit is maximum structural cruising speed. So it does help you understand in the limitation section of your POH exactly how they tested this. So like for instance, like the wide arc, is where you're going to stall with flaps out, but it says VSO in landing configuration at maximum weight. So how often are you landing your airplane at maximum weight? Probably not often. And so we also know that if you're not at maximum weight, you're supporting less weight. So if you're at the same speed as we just kind of talked about with the airfoils, going over some of those aerodynamic concepts, then you're at a lesser angle of attack, which means you would have more angle of attack available before you stall, which means that it's going to be slower than this value of 42. Continue with the green arc, and it also says maximum weight at VG at most forward CG. So obviously, if you had a bunch of baggage, right? What's going to happen with that, Christina? Oh, she's gone.
No, I'm still here. If I'm at, can you repeat that?
All right. So if you're flying, it says the bottom of the green arc is 47 knots, but it says the lower limit is at maximum weight VG at most forward CG with flaps retracted. So essentially, if we're flying at, let's see, at 47 or let's say 46 knots, okay, but we have a bunch of baggage in the aft baggage compartment and we're not at gross weight, are we still expecting to stall?
No, we might stall at a higher speed.
Okay. Generally speaking, what happens to stall speed is like CG moves forward. Is stall speed higher or lower with a more forward CG?
With a lower CG. Oh my gosh, it's embarrassing. Hold on.
She's looking it up online.
No, I'm not.
Google.
My brain is just failing me right now. I explain this left and right all the time.
Join me on the struggle bus because yes, it's been a rough chat for me too. Let's see here. Where's my am I still in Miro? What do I even? What am I sharing right now? Okay, let me POH up. So let me go to a whiteboard. Okay, cool. That's all still here. Let's clear that out. Try to export empty. Okay, so if the airplane is a teeter-totter, and this is the main wing here, and then the horizontal stabilizer / elevator combination, right, is an upside down airfoil. Oops. The camber is on the bottom. If this is the tail, it's generating a force down. I have an arrow tool. We'll ask the people at Zoom. Oh, nice. Generating a force down while this wing is lifting the weight up. So if the center of gravity is normally somewhere in this general vicinity, let's go with a different color. Up here, located in the general vicinity of the center of lift. If the center of gravity is up here, right, then this tail generates a down force in order for us to be able to balance our airplane. And if this is our airplane right here, and our airplane's like a teeter-totter, whoa, there we go. Then why does it do that? It's rotating around this general axis right here in the middle. So as the center of gravity moves this direction, the amount of downforce required by the tail decreases, right? It doesn't have to make as much force because more of the weight is distributed aft. Versus if the center of gravity moves forward, the tail has to make more downforce to balance that out because it's a longer arm back to the tail. And so it requires more downforce versus the center of gravity is back here. Let's definitely change it up again with lime green. No, that's the same lime green I had. Some nice blue colors. Versus the center of gravity is back here. The arm is not quite as long, which means the tail does not have to generate as much downforce. So if less downforce is being required with a more aft CG, does that increase or decrease the stall speed? It will decrease the stall speed. So if two airplanes have the exact same weight, let's just say 1,600 pounds, so it gives you a common theme. If 1,600 pounds, we'll say that this is kind of representing two separate airplanes. Which, best way to draw this, which one will have a higher stall speed? Well, let's see, more aft, lesser stall speed. Boom. Here, and then more forward, higher stall speed. Okay, so let's see, where's my, still sharing the POH. Not. Okay. I see the whiteboard. You all can see it. I cannot see it. Oh, there it is. Okay. So yeah, that's it for stall speed. Any questions on that as far as like, okay, like why? Actually, sorry, to correlate this back, looking at our POH again, based on this understanding that we now have, the airplane being configured with the most forward CG is indicated right here in the sentence, most forward CG. That means that this is the highest number. So max gross weight, maximum weight, most forward center of gravity. So this means this is the highest stall speed you could ever have. If the weight was the same weight, but it was comprised of most of, a decent amount of weight and baggage or whatever behind the pilot seats, this number would be lower. If you were at a lighter weight, it's less than 47. So essentially, you should never really stall at 47. If you do, you'd want to kind of check your aircraft loading to make sure you're kind of in the ballpark of being, within the weight and balance envelope. The yellow arc, we talked about that. That's the VNO kind of indication range up here, VNO, right? Maximum cruising speed starts at 107 knots. That's where it begins, but that continues all the way up to 141 knots, and that's the smooth air range. And then red line, we know that is VNE, maximum speed for all operations. Now, of course, being limitations, the V speeds are things that are there for your safety and protect the airplane. There are tolerances. So like red line being VNE, the airplane's been tested beyond that. It's like 115%. The load factor limits that we were talking about, we'll talk about more in just a second. Those are also, there's 150% extra on that. So, the wings aren't just going to magically break off at 4.4 Gs. You actually would have to get significantly more, I guess 4.4 times 1.5, you're looking at 6.6. So, there's a safety factor that goes into all those. Also important limitations before I move on. Actually, any questions on these speeds or anything like that? Going once, twice, 3 times. Okay, feel free to throw it in the chat later. If you do have anything, power plant limitations, horsepower, maximum engine RPM, oil pressure, things like that. Just generally good operating practices, limitations for operating your engine effectively. Weights, we've talked about this. 1,600 pounds being the max gross weight. Max gross weight, of course, is a weight that you'll see pretty commonly in like training airplanes and stuff. You start looking at bigger airplanes, you start getting things like the maximum weight you can be out on the ground, but then it's there's a maximum takeoff weight, which is less than that because they assume that if you load the airplane up to its maximum weight and then taxi to the runway, that you're going to burn off some fuel at some point, and so you might actually be able to put more weight in the airplane than you can actually take off with. That's another example of that. But this airplane just has 1,600 pounds across the board. Center of gravity limits, very important. Be familiar with those, right? In terms of like loading weight forward and aft. Maneuvering limits. Most airplanes, put in, hey, these are some suggested speeds for certain maneuvers. These are all, maneuvers that you will do probably on a check ride at some point, for whether it be from steep turns to some of the commercial maneuvers, John Dell's Lazy Eights, 95 knots. It's placarded as a maximum entry speed, and generally speaking, there's a note, higher speeds can be used if abrupt use of the controls is avoided, right? The reason they say abrupt use of the controls is avoided is because of what we talked about in the beginning with maneuvering speed, because you don't want to be in a position where you're overstressing the airframe. Flight load factor limits, right? This is the 4.4 with flaps up, 3.5 with flaps down, 1.76. Oh, there's that note I was just talking about. Design load factors are 150% above, and in all cases, the structure meets or exceeds design loads. So there's the safety buffer. Kinds of operations limits. This basically just tells you, hey, what equipment's on board your airplane? What can you use it for? What is it certified for? What can it do? What can it not do? Fuel capacity, right? We've got our fuel that you can actually put in the tanks, and then how much fuel is actually, able to reach the engine, because of the shape of the fuel tank and whatnot. There might be some fuel that is out of reach of the pickup or the collector, where the tank drains, that it might, be outside the reach of that when you're in flight for whatever reason. And so not all of that fuel is usable. So that's something to consider. Fuel tank options, that's a big one to think about. A lot of people fly a lot of different airplanes. Maybe you fly an airplane that you've flown before, and you've for example, flown multiple different 150s. Being just familiar with your airplane, knowing if your airplane has the long range tanks or not. I know people that have been surprised when they've landed places to get fuel and put in more fuel than they thought they were going to, or whatever, because they didn't realize the airplane they were flying had a different size fuel tank than other airplanes of that exact same make and model. Just like your car, there's optional equipment. Not everything has the air conditioning seats these days. There's still plenty of cars you can get without it. So just kind of considering, those optional features. You can't cross flow. Placards, this tells you, hey, these things are supposed to be in your airplane. There's supposed to be signs that say this, checking those all out. And that's it. So that's the limitation section of your POH. A lot of good information in there. Depending on the airplane, it'll be longer or not. But any questions about limitations? If I wrap that up, I know we spent a lot of time talking about aerodynamics, because that aerodynamics of that really applies to most of that section. It's kind of the same aerodynamics for pretty much all those speeds. You can derive literally any of them from that example. And otherwise, it's just good stuff about your airplane. So thoughts?
Any questions? Does anybody have? Sydney? Christina got picked on. I loved it. That was great. Rachel, do you have any questions?
I do not. Thank you. This is a fantastic review. I appreciate it.
It really is. James, you did an excellent job. Really. It was good. I know you could go on forever too about like more and more and more like good stuff. So Flight Apprentice, does such a good job because you guys write all your own, you know, material, and it's all good, precise. And James, if you want to add anything else, we recorded this, so if you guys want a copy of it to review, obviously I'm sure some of you do. I can send it to you once I upload it. But yeah, James, is there anything else you want to add?
No, that was it. Thanks for having me. I have no interest in ever watching this video. So I'm not going to put it in my professional portfolio or anything, but thanks for hanging out with me, everybody. This was fun. And like I said, it was a good practice run for figuring stuff out. And next time I'll actually have my stylus, my drawing pad. Like I said, I opened my box and I was like, where is the pen? I don't know
so
where
funny.
it went.
I literally just gave him like a couple hour notice. I'm like, hey, you want to do tonight? Since we don't have anybody that can do it except for me. And he took the pressure off me having to plan it out and just took it over. So James, thank you so much for being here for Girls of the Fly. And I think I don't know what's going on with the link, but I think some people tried to come on a different link, and I have 2 links going around out there. So I'm going to fix that. So if anybody reaches out to you saying they couldn't join, well, sorry, because I have to figure out the link situation. But James, we'd love to have you back again for other stuff.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'll look forward to it. Everybody,
Cool.
Yeah, great work.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Everybody have a really good night, and let me know if you want the link, today's link. All right.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.